Hello, and welcome to the Creation Gospel, the Spirit-Filled Family Series. We are continuing this series. In this program, we're going to make a transition. We have had a series of programs on Spirit-Filled husbands. We've had Spirit-Filled children. And now, that moment you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, whether you're husband or wife, Spirit-Filled wives. I know the guys felt like I beat up on them a little bit, probably in Spirit-Filled husbands, and so I am an equal opportunity teacher. And so hopefully we can speak some truth into Spirit-Filled wives that will make the guys feel a little less picked on in terms of the practical advice from the Word itself. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In this particular chapter, we addressed how Paul was living at a significant time period. In fact, in his text, he actually mentions that the time is being shortened. That's actually a key to understanding the book of Hebrews, is that the time is shortened in terms of how much longer the temple can stand. And so he is adjusting people's expectations, trying to give very practical advice without ignoring the words of the Torah, without ignoring the wisdom of Jewish law that he was an expert in. We even saw that it appeared that he's trying to impose upon them a more merciful approach to issues about remaining single, becoming married, divorce, remarriage, and so forth. But as we move from the single to the wife, I think that particular text is too important to leave behind too soon, because in that chapter he addressed so many parts of the family, whether it's the betrothed, single, whether it's the divorced, whether it is those in a marriage of being unequally yoked. He really touches on several different family roles. And so before we leave that key text, I want to address some more. I would like to start about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32. And we're going to take some of these principles as we continue and kind of transition and see what Paul is trying to teach us that applies both to the Spirit-Filled single as well as the Spirit-Filled wife or husband. And I think that will give us a platform from there to move in specifically to the expectations of the Spirit-Filled wife in a believing marriage, or even if you find yourself unequally yoked. Because like we said in the last program, you may have been equally yoked when you were married, but at some point in the marriage, someone had an experience, a salvation experience, a dramatic revelation of faith. And it makes such an impact in your life that you find yourself now unequally yoked in the spiritual sense. And so Paul was giving some practical advice there. So I'd like to pick up with verse 32. He says, "But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband." This is sounding a little bad, but just hold on here. Verse 35, he says, "This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord." Now, in our last program, we talked about ultimately one of the major goals of marriage is happiness. So it said the man even stays home from war the first year of his marriage to make his wife happy. Because what he finds out is by making her happy, that it's reflexive. He also becomes happy, becomes a happy marriage. But Paul is talking here about single versus married, and he talks about remaining single being a gift. Not everybody has the gift, but if that's your gift, marriage may actually be the unhappy choice for you. And so he's saying it's okay to remain single if that is your gift. Because it would definitely have to be a gift. But what he's promoting here is happiness that creates a productiveness within your spiritual life. If you're miserable, it's hard to be spiritually productive. And that's what he's saying. It's for your own benefit, not to put restraint on, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. If you're distracted by unhappiness, it's going to affect your ability and devotion in the work of the kingdom. So I'd like to look at these verses in more detail as we're going to call them, the cosmic singles versus the cosmic married person. And where are we getting cosmic? Well, it has to do with the word administration. In Greek, cosmic is how you order things or how you administrate resources. And so Paul's motivation in his wording is so that singles, as well as married men and married women, will prioritize their lives to bring forth the greatest fruit in the kingdom. It says in Deuteronomy 32:29, would that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would discern their future. How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight? So you can see there's more strength in doubles, which is a problem for the single, unless that single can acquire someone to help pull in that yoke. And often that can be accomplished through mentors, through counselors, people of like-minded faith. Paul is not reversing the Torah principle of 1 versus 2 in terms of productiveness, but he's reinforcing his view that being yoked with an unbeliever is worse than remaining single. And so ideally, in the Torah's perfection, 2 being equally yoked would be the most productive combination. The problem, he's saying, for a married couple is it's much more difficult for them to achieve unity in their devotion, because now you have 2 sets of priorities. And those 2 sets of priorities must be merged into the one list. See, he has a list and she has a list. We have to take both these lists and merge them into one that is most likely to be fruitful in terms of productivity. For the single, there's only one list, your list of priorities. So, although potentially the couple can be more productive, it's much harder for them to achieve the unity required for that productiveness. The single has no need to enter into that negotiation every day. Nor would the single be distracted with the things necessary to maintain peace in the home, that shalom habayit. You only have to be at peace with yourself if you're single. But for the married couple, we now have to take both our lists and come up with one productive list. That means we have to learn to prioritize. Now in verse 36 he goes on and says, but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. Now, although in modern Jewish marriages, they tend to streamline the customs of erusin, betrothal, and nisuin, consummation, in the first century, a significant amount of time could pass between the betrothal agreement and the actual cohabitation of the couple. And usually this was an economic decision. Sometimes the children were betrothed by their families at very young ages. So if the child had not reached puberty, then obviously the conclusion of the marriage was not possible. Likewise, if the groom didn't have the economic provision for the marriage, then that consummation stage was postponed until a home could be prepared. And a responsible father might prolong that nisuin stage of the marriage for various reasons, but the most common ones would be the groom's lack of economic preparedness to support his new wife, or for the daughter's young age. Paul is talking here about a daughter who is of age, but the father has not released her to fulfill that second stage there of the marriage. So a responsible father who has a betrothed daughter may be very wisely postponing that stage of her marriage out of concern that their different views, their different faith would affect the peace in that household, especially if his daughter had come to faith in Messiah Yeshua. Now, see, if they were betrothed under one expectation, but now she is a believer, this could be a significant problem for the new couple. And if the father is postponing, in order to give the betrothed groom time to convert, this poor little virgin daughter might be growing old waiting. That's an economic reality and a religious reality of that generation. It says, "But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided that in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better." So Paul accepts that there's going to be pressure for the couple to marry regardless of the differences. But the better choice in such a case is going to be withhold her from that full union until the peace in the house in the future can be assured. He says a wife is bound as long as her husband lives. But if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So once that consummation stage of the marriage is complete, the young woman is going to be bound to her husband until he dies or divorces her. Remarriage, according to Paul, whether contracted after a divorce from the erusin or the nisuin stages, it's permissible only to another believer in order to maintain shalom habayit, peace in the home. But he says, in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. Nice little thing to throw in there. But he separates his opinion from anything that Yeshua or the Torah taught. However, he's pointing out the Ruach works in me. So for Paul, remaining single after separation from a spouse through death or divorce, it leads to a happier life for one whose heart's desire is to serve the King of Kings, like Hannah in the temple. So she shouldn't be pressured to remarry if that is her heart's desire. And as you look into the ministry of Paul, he was very open about incorporating single-minded believing women into his ministry in different capacities. He highly respected the work of female apostles. But if one's heart's desire is to be married, then obviously remaining single would not produce that happiness. So, as 39 states, she's free to marry another believer. After all, the point of being married is to cheer up your spouse, right? So if being married doesn't sound cheerful, remaining single might be the answer. Which leads us to verses 32 through 35. And this is important because as a married woman or a married husband, remember these truths really transcend our family role. But they do speak specifically to certain roles. He says, one who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. One who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. Prioritizing or administration, that is a word that's being used there, cosmos in the Greek. One who is married is concerned about the things of the world, cosmos, administrating, prioritizing. So he's saying the greatest advantage of a single believer is flexibility in prioritization. These are not absolute categories of concern, but matters of priority. Because it's ridiculous to think that Paul is saying a single person can function independently from the things of the world. It would also be ridiculous to think that he's saying a married person is only concerned about the things of the world to the exclusion of the things of the Lord. What he's saying is because the single person is not obligated to maintain unity in a relationship to a spouse, he or she is free to schedule his or her life in order best to serve the kingdom. The married person also schedules service to the kingdom. But, remember the two lists becoming one list? It requires the input of the spouse in order to create that list of activities each day. Because as we saw in Spirit-Filled Singles, in the previous context of 1 Corinthians 7, unity and agreement in decisions is vital to the success of the marriage. And it's also vital to the success of their spiritual life. So without this spouse's agreement on the list of priorities, the list is going to be skewed. Because it says that unity in a marriage is what draws the favor of heaven in service, especially prayer. If not, prayers are hindered. If there's disagreement in the marriage, prayers are hindered. And so for couples, prayer is cosmic. That's something to remember. We each have gifts. We have obligations. We have needs that affect how we administrate our resources each day. And so how the single being free to prioritize however he or she desires those activities, there's really only one insight. That's why it's important for the single to have good mentorship, good counsel, or to function as a good mentor or good counsel to others from that basis of experience. But the married couple has the double list of gifts and obligations, the needs, and that affects the family resources. It's much more difficult to assemble the cosmic couple list than the cosmic single list. But this is the advantage that Paul is speaking of. And so what he's saying is it's not that because the single doesn't have to, so much consider the needs of another in making that daily list. He's not saying that because as a disciple of Yeshua, single or not, you do make up that daily list with regard for the needs of other people. Those significant people in your life that are within your sphere of influence. The idea of being a kingdom servant requires the single to prioritize in order to meet the needs of others. Yet the challenge that the single has is the absence of a second opinion. And that can lead over time to closed vision. So, just as it's written that no prophecy of Scripture is open to private interpretation, the same danger applies to those who do not regularly consider wise counsel in administrating their lives. Vision will become closed or skewed. Unilateral decisions are dangerous. Proverbs 11:14 says, "Where no counsel is, the people fail." The people fall. But in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. Proverbs 24:6 says, "For by wise counsel thou shalt make thy war, and in multitude of counselors there is safety." So we've got two parallels there. We've got the couple or the double principle. And because of that double principle, it's up to the single to find a wise mentor, to have that second in the yoke, somebody of like kind, of like mind, someone with whom to forge close relationships of trust. Now for the female, if we read Titus chapter 2, it's written in Scripture that wise older women are the best source of mentoring. For the male, the same holds true, so that no reproach will be brought to the name of the Holy One. And that's, something that the single needs to keep in mind, but also the married couple as well. If one of those two within the marriage is functioning as a mentor or a counselor to a single person. A mentor should be a person with whom a sexual relationship is not a temptation. If parents are living, I think they can remain good mentors once they kind of transition to accepting the single child as an adult. That's difficult sometimes. But we see Timothy's mother and grandmother trained him in the Holy Scriptures. So I can't imagine that their relationship of trust ended once he attained adulthood. But because of their faithful parenting, Timothy became Paul's protege. And his aptitude at such a young age, we can likely credit to that diligent mentoring of his mother and his grandmother. There again, you have to let those babies grow up. And so if that young male has a mother type of mentor or a young female has a father type of mentor, you have to take extremely diligent care that counsel relationship be carried on in purity. Now, in a purely practical sense, that means open doors, public meetings, and family members, ideally the spouse, in the immediate area. There are no closed-door meetings. Everything decently and in order. Ideally, if there is any cross-gender counseling, then that counselor spouse or some responsible adult should actually be present. That's the pattern we see with Priscilla and Aquila when they were mentoring Apollos. So the spouse should also be comfortable with that mentoring relationship, for they are assuming a role much like parenting grown children. And if there is no agreement, remember what he said, Satan works in unilateral decisions. The Hebrew word for safety in Proverbs in those verses that we read, in terms of safety in the multitude of counsel, that Hebrew word is teshuah, a derivative of yasha, or salvation, and shavah, to cry aloud for help. See, good counsel should be a safe relationship that results in the freedom for the single to act or decide according to the mentor's experience in walking the Word. The counsel should improve the single's walk. For an evil counselor will actually cause the singles fall. And remember that in Proverbs. The plans are going to fall. The person will fall with wicked counsel. So it's not safe to have an evil counsel or counselor, nor is it safe to conduct one's life without counsel. And so, as we look at the pattern there, what we realize is, as we kind of transition from single to married to the Spirit-filled wife, is that in terms of the relationships within the body of Messiah, Paul is stressing that, number one, we don't really walk alone. Even as he's talking about remaining single, he's still talking about levels of authority. For instance, that responsible father not releasing his daughter into a marriage that he knows will be nothing but chaos and trouble because of the difference in their faiths. Ensuring that other person with whom she is going to be yoked is not just economically responsible. Paul is actually adding in the consideration of Can he keep her safe in her spiritual walk? Or will he actually become her tormentor in her spiritual walk? And so the question is it better to be in a marriage, unequally yoked, with someone who will mock your faith, ignore your faith, make it difficult and put obstacles of your faith, when truthfully there's enough of those obstacles out there in the world without someone within your own household, your safe place. Remember that Hebrew word for safety is used, safety in a multitude of counsel. What does a good counselor do? They provide a safe place for the one receiving counsel. Now, while the single might need to rely on a mentor, on a counselor in their relationships to provide that counterbalance, it is really difficult for them sometimes to discern who is that safe person, who is that tested and tried and true person that I can trust to help me in making my decisions in terms of administrating my life for the kingdom. But for the married person, for the Spirit-filled wife, she's going to serve in one of two roles. She will also become that mentor and that counselor for her Spirit-filled husband, and she will be one who looks to that Spirit-filled husband as a place of safety. He becomes that Yasha, or Shava, the one to whom she can cry aloud for help. And we do that at different points in our life. The pain is so great that we cry aloud to our spouses for help. And if we're unequally yoked, sometimes we're afraid to do that because we don't know what the response will be. It will not be a Spirit-filled response. And so as Paul's teaching this, he's setting a great foundation for us to move into what it means to be a Spirit-filled wife.
Shalom, guys. This is Matthew Vanderels over at Hebraic Roots Network. Guys, we continue broadcasting these teachings of Yeshua, of Torah, to all nations by support by viewers like you. We'd ask you, if you currently do not support HRN, prayerfully consider sending us a one-time donation or maybe even a monthly donation to HRN so we can continue supporting the nations with the gospel of Yeshua. It's up to you, guys. It's up to you to keep this message going, and we thank you for that. Shalom.
Welcome back. Welcome back, Spirit-filled wives. Now, I know the guys are probably listening in because, like I said, they're probably not completely convinced that I'm an equal opportunity toe stepper honor. But I think we're about to get there. We're about to put the other side of the yoke in here in terms of the Spirit-filled wives. So let's go ahead and let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, that lovely chapter that we read, that we don't necessarily enjoy reading, because this particular passage has some very specific things to say to wives. And there again, if we only look at this passage in terms of what it's saying at a very literal level, it's not very pleasant. It seems to be based on some assumptions about women. But when we dig deeper, we're going to unpack some very important words within these instructions to women, the same way that we looked at Exodus 24:10 and unpacked some very important words as it pertained to men. Right? So in 1 Peter 3:1, it says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior." Now right there, that's huge. I mean, we could spend a lot of time just on those two verses. What does it mean to be submissive? Can I really say more without saying anything? Yes. Yes. Like I said, a very literal level, it says what it says. But we're going to unpack some more of it. Because it says, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. And that's one thing about it. Men are very action-oriented. They're not so verbal as women are. We think that we're going to win everybody with the word, by speech, by talking. But men are more, put your money where your mouth is. Put some action to it. And in fact, when they see your chaste behavior, when they see that you're living in purity according to the word, and they notice that you have respect for them, apparently that makes a greater impact than 1,000,000 words, than 10 million words. They're looking at what you do, not necessarily listening to what you say. Even Abraham had to be reminded, listen to Sarah's voice, and she was a prophetess. Let's go on to verse 3. It says, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children, if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. All right, thank you, Peter, for your insights on the married life. And now we want to move on and address Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And we'll start in verse 21 and see if he's preaching a different marriage doctrine here, or if he's repeating some themes. So in verse 21 it says, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. That sounds like Paul again. That sounds like the study that we did in Corinthians, where he's talking about mutuality, about agreement, about being partners. He goes on and he says, wives, be subject to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So here's the question. Is this passage to the Ephesians, is it talking about physical things, or is it talking about spiritual things? Is it talking about the relationship between a husband and wife? Or is it talking about the relationship between Messiah and Israel? Which is it? The answer is yes. Just like Paul, he's going to give you both the spiritual and the physical. Now remember, he also writes But the physical is revealed first, then the spiritual. Maybe that's why he feels compelled in verse 32, after he writes, to go back and clarify. He says, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, back to the physical. Each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. Remember that definition back in Exodus 24:10 of the coverings? One of those 3 obligations of every able-bodied husband to cover his wife, and used reflexively, it means to cover himself. So Paul is still speaking in reference to the Torah itself, to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So you can see a theme here. Whether we're looking at the passage written by Peter, or whether we're looking at the passage written by Paul, it can be taken only as practical advice in the physical realm, or we can pay more attention, like Paul is cautioning us, that it's also talking about spiritual things. So we're calling it the spirit-filled family. How do the qualities of chokhmah, wisdom, bina, understanding, etzah, counsel, bura, power, endurance, da'at, sacrificial love, and yirat Adonai, the reverence of Adonai. What parts do those spiritual things play into all this good practical advice that Peter and Paul are giving to wives and husbands? Because remember, in the Spirit-filled husbands, we saw how men have to work harder to love their wives sacrificially, with the love of da'at. Da'at is sacrificial love. Just if you've forgotten really the depth of what da'at is, then go back and review from Workbook 1, the Creation Gospel, and go back to the 6th day of creation, that 6th spirit, and Yom Kippur, as well as the Church of Philadelphia, to see that pattern of sacrificial love, da'at. But what you see is 4 times in the passage to the Ephesians, Paul is commanding men to love their wives. Now remember, real estate is important in Scripture. Where verses are situated on the real estate, you only have so much real estate on the pages. Where something is positioned on the real estate is important, but also important is how many times that appears to take up the real estate. There are no extraneous words, not even a jot or a tittle, Yeshua says. Nothing is extra, nothing is unneeded. And so when you see the repetition of themes or words, then that real estate by itself is a flashing red light to slow down and take a look. So if they are telling us, if Peter and Paul agree that men struggle with sacrificial love, if that's a problem for them, then what spirit is it? If they're struggling with da'at, knowledge, what spirit is it that women struggle with? Well, if we look at the repetition, if we look at the real estate on the pages, there is a repetition of a word, of a concept, referring to a specific spirit of Adonai. And it has to do with words related like fear or respect. Now there are other related words to fear and respect that we could possibly put in the same cluster. If we were going to do a cluster diagram, words like subject and submissive in that context. And so if you're taking notes, I think those would be the words that I would underline or circle or write on a piece of paper to pay attention to because of the real estate. Fear, respect, subject, submissive. Because we want to find out what these words mean in context. Not just in the context of these particular passages, but we want to recall our lessons from Workbook 1, the Creation Foundation. We want to find out the full context of things like fear, respect, subject, submission from the beginning. And if we can do that, then I think it's going to open some gates of wisdom for us in reading the book of Revelation, where you have these parables of the harlot and the virtuous woman. Because there is a specific context in these passages where it talks about, as we go on, let's move back here, because it talks about just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. And so it's saying to become a child of Sarah. And this is important because, in the prophets it says, look to Abraham, your father, and Sarah, who gave birth to you in pain. He was one when I called him. And then it goes on to compare the two of them, to cast them both in their respective roles, which, as you can discern from the context, that they're using like images to compare Sarah and Abraham. They're actually saying Sarah and Abraham were one when I called him. It's teaching you about that unity of the Spirit. And it talks about the children of Sarah. She was that righteous woman. If you will remember in the Scarlet Harlot and the Crimson Thread, Sarah was one who held that crimson thread that strung all the way to the book of Revelation. Because remember, it was promised that Sarah would be the mother of many nations. She's going to be the mother of many righteous. But when we get to the book of Revelation, there is the mother of abominations, the harlot. And she also commits abominations with the kings of the earth. She's Sarah's opposite. All right? And it says that you will become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. And there again, there's a play on words, because yirat, yirat, in Hebrew, it has two aspects. It can mean both respect in a positive sense, or it can mean terror, the terror aspect of fear. And so we get to choose how we relate to doing what is right. And so you see there's implications here in very deep spiritual places in terms of, this is just practical advice to wives, but it's much deeper. It's talking about spiritual things. And that's why Paul has to call our attention to the fact that this mystery is great. I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. He's speaking about the things that John is speaking about in Revelation. But we want to peel it back and again start looking at it at a more literal level. I think we've already kind of elevated ourselves to that spiritual level in the Scarlet Harlot series with Workbook 4. But let's look at it practically, because Paul always presents you two sides, the physical and the spiritual. So we've already seen from our previous context that men struggle with sacrificial love. They struggle to keep things at a very physical level because it's easier for them to apprehend. That's the way that they are wired. But there is a spirit with which women struggle. And there again, look at the real estate, fear and respect. Both of those expressions denote the yirat Adonai, the reverence of Adonai. The reverence of Adonai, if we're looking at a menorah, is the seventh spirit of Adonai. It is the fullness of the spirit of Adonai. And because it's the seventh, it is connected at its source with the first branch of the menorah, which is wisdom, chokhmah. And that's exactly what the scripture says. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. Right? So that's the foundation. If there is no foundation of respect, then there really is no insight and wisdom. And so by focusing this one aspect of reverence or respect and aiming it at spirit-filled wives, what we realize is that reverence is giving value, not just value. Reverence is giving high value to another. And so if I respect you, then I am assigning value to you. Now, it doesn't mean that I worship you. There's a difference. And that's where people, a lot of times, they misunderstand things they see. They might see one person rendering respect to another, and they say, well, you're just idolizing that person. That may not be what's happening. I may simply be rendering a high value to that other person. Now, it's kind of ironic that we have trouble giving respect to people of like faith, but if our favorite football player walked in the room, we would have no problem giving him reverence and respect, right? If a favorite movie star walked in the room, there would be no problem giving reverence or respect. But it's almost as though there's something inside us that rebels at giving not just reverence and respect to those of like kind and like faith, but sometimes even within our marriage, we have trouble giving respect to our spouses. Well, here's the problem with that. When you enter into that yoke, that equal yoke with a spouse, that's really the one person on this earth that we should be able to rely upon to make us feel respected. And by making us feel respected, I mean to feel as though this person has assigned a high value to me. This person believes that I am valuable. Why? Well, this person chose me out of every other woman on earth. So this man has assigned a high value to me. By the same token, I chose this man out of all the other men on earth. And so he should be able to rely on me to consistently assign to him a high value, as opposed to the value I would place upon any other person. It's fine to respect other people. It's important to respect other people and to render respect, especially to those of like faith, like kind, and like mind. But out of all the people on earth, it is your spouse who should sense that you have assigned the highest value to who they are and the role that they play in your life. And for wives, sometimes we feel like we're rendering that respect to our husbands, but something is lost in translation. And it's, like I told the husbands, because we were created to be an azer kenegdo, what they perceive often as nagging, we think we're helping. We believe that we're fulfilling our assigned role. But how you deliver those messages of help, that's critical in helping them to feel respected and valued, or whether you believe you're doing the right thing, you believe you're helping, but in the way that you deliver the message, it has the opposite effect. And instead of making this person feel valued, the message actually makes the person feel devalued, unimportant, like he'll never measure up to your expectations, like he can never meet all your needs, like he can never do enough, like he can never be enough. To you, you're helping. But what he's hearing on the other end of it, this is what we're being cautioned about by both Peter and Paul, is that we need to consider the impact of our words. And above all, see, there's not going to be any trouble with the submission aspect on either end. When we can transmit the messages within a marriage in a tone and an emotion of respect for the other person. And for men, this is very important. They need validation. That's kind of their gasoline. And so when we see that Adam and Eve sinned, they both experienced a negative aspect of reverence. See, when it's not engaged properly, you see the other side of respect, and that is that it creates fear or terror. See, it's the same Hebrew word, yirat, and it will describe both manifestations. And when we do not have enough fear of Adonai, then what we see was that negative fear came in to fill that void. Right? So when we do not respect our husbands adequately, then a negative aspect of fear will come in and fill that void. Whether we begin to experience that fear, and that is very likely, because often in our helping our husbands, what we're actually speaking out of our mouths is fear. We're afraid that we won't be able to make ends meet. We're afraid that the children are taking a wrong path. I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that. And trying to deal with those fears of the future, what he begins to hear is that he's not doing enough, being enough, providing enough. And so speaking out of the negative aspect of fear, what he feels is the disrespect, and then he in turn starts to fear. See, in the transmission of the message, if there is a sense that I value you. See, when we learn how to do that, we can transmit the message in such a way that even though we are kind of delivering negative information, because he hears the respect that we have for what he does, he is much more open to what else we might be asking him to do or to be aware of. And see, assigning blame is counterproductive. In fact, assigning blame is one of the most disrespectful things that we can do. Now, I'm not saying it isn't difficult to have a conversation about some things without saying you did this or you didn't do that. It's very difficult. I'm not going to say it's easy. But with practice, we can learn to deliver a message sometimes that says, okay, we still lack these things, but we're a team. I'm here to help you. And so that we're not creating that negative aspect, that nakedness of fear within the relationship where he doesn't even want to have a conversation at all because all he's going to hear is bad things. But if you'll create the sandwich to deliver that information where there needs improvement. The sandwich being some sort of affirmation of respect or value, and then the difficult part, and then end it with an affirmation of respect and value. He has the sandwich, but he's not made to feel a failure as we address those things. It says we have to obey without any fear. And that's that negative aspect of fear. We make that up, we fix that thing by learning how to respect and transmit our sense of value for the other. We'll pick up next time.